can start now.
My name is Martha Quillin. I'm a staff reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. I've been a reporter for the newspaper since 1987. So I've been here 32 years.
Oh, wow. Have you always wanted to be a reporter? Sorry question.
No, I thought I would be a teacher. And so I came up through the public schools in the 1970s. I graduated from high school in Greensboro in 1979, and I thought I would be a teacher. I planned to teach English in high school. But when I talked to all the teachers I had idolized in high school, they said that I would be miserably unhappy and that I should consider something else. And so it was just by happenstance. I was always a strong writer, and I met someone who was a customer in a grocery store. It was at Kroger's, as a matter of fact, when I worked at Kroger grocery stores in the 1970s, in the 1970s. And there was a gentleman who shopped in there who was retired from the newspaper business. He had worked at the Greensboro Daily News and Record, and he suggested that I consider a job in newspapers. And so I actually did start there. I worked at the Greensboro Daily News and Record a very long time ago.
Oh, wow. Okay. So might as well start off with the first question. Did you choose to follow the Blanche Taylor Moore trial, or was it assigned to you by someone?
Well, the way my job works is a little bit of both. I get stories that are assigned to me. I get some that I gin up on my own. In this particular case, I was on the state desk at that time, and we sort of divided the state. There were only 4 or 5 of us on the state desk, and we tried to stay. We tried not to overlap, so that we weren't all, bumping into one another. And so we sort of divided the state up geographically, and also, and so that was kind of my area. Geographically, that part of the state was my area. But also, when I was in high school, I worked at Kroger, and I knew her, and so I was keenly interested in this story and wanted to cover it. So there was probably a little bit of both.
Okay. Did you attend the trial? Like, were you in the room, or was it more like outside?
I was in the courtroom every day, and at the very end of it, another reporter came and helped so that we could reach people at the end of it. When a trial ends, particularly if it's a trial that has a lot of public interest, it's great to have a second or even a third person. Sometimes a photographer will be there, and they can help also, because at the end of the proceedings, you might want to talk to family members on both sides. You might want to try and talk to the lawyers if they'll talk to you. And people begin to disperse very quickly. And so the last day or two, while the jury was deliberating, another reporter named Julie Reeves came and helped me. But otherwise I was there every day.
Okay. Can you describe the atmosphere of the courtroom?
Well, it was not really what I had anticipated. I think I've covered a lot of trials. The News and Observer used to have more staff, and so we used to be able to dedicate a lot of time to trials, and we would do what we called gavel-to-gavel coverage. Sometimes we would even be there for jury selection, and then come back when the trial began, and we would be there every day, and you begin to recognize and be recognized by the family members who come in, and local community members who might be curious for one reason or another, or were friends of a victim or whatever. And so these are people who would come in and out of the courtroom. And in this case, because it is so unusual to have a woman tried for murder on a case that could go to a death penalty phase, we thought there would be a tremendous amount of interest, and there was toward the end, but it was a fairly subdued trial. It was not a circus atmosphere by any means. It was as if she was, being tried for, a white-collar crime almost at some times. There were a few very emotional moments that came from testimony from the stand, but the atmosphere, mostly in the courtroom, was pretty. There were a couple of notable departures from that. There was some emotion that was shown by the defense attorney. Wait a minute, I beg your pardon. It was a prosecutor. It was a prosecutor who broke down a little bit in tears, and they had to call it a day. The judge called it a day, and sent everybody home a little bit early because a prosecutor had called a witness to the stand, and she began to cry when she saw him move. He was also a victim of Blanche Moore's, and this woman was very upset to see how the lingering injuries that he had. He reached out to pick up a water cup or something, and he was trembling because of the neurological damage from the poisoning. And so just seeing him do that got this prosecutor very upset, and she started to cry and had to turn away from the jury. And the judge called it a day and said they would just come back the next day.
Okay. Wow, that's deep.
Yeah, it was odd. I had not seen that before.
Okay. Can you sort of describe Ms. Moore, Blanche Taylor Moore, like how she appeared and acted during the trial?
Well, she was a very attractive woman. She's about 86 years old now. I looked it up to see where she was and how old she is. She's about 86 now. She was in her 50s when this happened, late 50s when she was tried. And very attractive woman for her age. Very concerned about her appearance. You could tell that she took good care of herself. She coiffed her hair, she did her makeup. And my recollection is that she dressed nicely. She's a petite woman, not very tall, but sharp looking. And so her appearance was very pleasant. She was very attractive. And her demeanor, most of the time, she looked like she was paying very close attention. She would sometimes nod her head, when somebody testified. If it was something that she was familiar with, she would, nod her head. Occasionally, I think she said, "That's right, that's right." And then when she took the stand, she was very self-assured. Defiant may go a little bit overboard. It'll be a little bit too strong a word, but she was very self-assured. And when she was challenged by the prosecutors when they asked her questions, she had the demeanor of a person who really felt like she had the truth on her side and that they needed to prove something, and she didn't believe it. It looked to me like she didn't think they were proving their case.
Okay. Did this affect anyone either in or out of the courtroom, like her appearance or her emotions?
People commented on how attractive she was because she had been married a couple of times. She was she was accused of murdering. Well, she was accused of poisoning 3 people. That's what she was. Charges were brought against her for poisoning 3 men, and they suspected that she had poisoned a 4th, which would have been her dad. So, she was someone who was attractive to men, and so people talked about that. You could not help notice that. But whether the jury was swayed one way or the other by her appearance, I really couldn't say. I didn't get to talk to the jurors after this much. Most of them did not want to talk. I can't imagine that they wouldn't have noticed that she was attractive, but I don't know that it would have affected their judgment of her one way or another, except to note that, she had no shortage of people who wanted to marry her.
Okay. Do you think Blanche Taylor Moore's early family life affected her image during court?
Her image?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there were diametrically opposing portraits of her early life. Her dad was a part-time minister and a mill worker, and my recollection is that he was gone quite a lot. He was the ministry that he did. I believe he was an itinerant minister, so he didn't pastor real close to the house a lot. I think he traveled about some, and the clear position of the prosecution was that he was abusive to her, although they did not exactly, I think maybe he spanked her some, but they didn't say whether it was sexual abuse or physical abuse or exactly what, emotional abuse. He also had an affair while he was married to Blanche's mother. Now, the prosecution put that out there as a way of saying, her very first relationship with a man, her father, was tainted by his bad behavior, and so she started from a very young age of not liking men. The defense said, nah, that's not true. She had a very loving relationship with her father. Yes, he did have affairs, and yes, she knew about it, but she she, to the degree that she was hurt by that, she was only hurt on behalf of her mother. It did not hurt her directly, and so she would have no reason to hate him or any other man in her life. So we don't really know which of those was true.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, they did dig up his body, and he did bear the signs of arsenic poisoning. So we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain her, I think you quoted in one of your articles, it said her hatred for men who had the same vices as her father?
Well, yeah. So her dad, as I mentioned, her dad was a pastor, and or a part-time pastor at least, and he did have affairs, multiple affairs is what we understood. And so then when she married, and her dad may also have gambled. I'm not certain about that detail, whether her father was a gambler or not. But a couple of the men that she became romantically involved with were gamblers. And her second husband, Dwight Moore, was not a gambler, but he was a pastor like her dad. And he had been married before he married Blanche, and he had an affair with a secretary at a church where he worked in Virginia for like 19 years. Oh, and wow. He admitted to this. Mm-hmm. So he had this affair ongoing for 19 years, and Blanche may or may not have known about that when she married him, but she certainly knew about it after they were married, and she remarked on it to her stepdaughter, and said that this was when Dwight Moore was sick, and as it turned out, had been poisoned with arsenic, was in the hospital and was very, very sick. Blanche remarked to her stepdaughter that he was an evil man and he deserved what he got, and that was a reference to his having had this affair.
Okay.
We don't know whether she was attracted to men who had vices, or if, all men have vices, and she married a couple of them, and so, she was just by nature married to somebody that had vices. But anyway, she did notice them.
Besides the letter from Gavin Thomas, can you recall what other defenses her lawyer had?
Let's see, what would have been? Well, that was his main defense, was that letter from, I believe it was Garvin Thomas, the mythical Garvin Thomas. He was a person, he was an actual person, but the letter, they had an SBI agent come in and testify about that letter, and the prosecution believed that she manufactured that on her own and had it sent to herself in jail. But I think to drum up any other kind of defense, they would have, their choices were that, she had some sort of a mental defect, which they did not argue because she, I'm sure, would not have allowed them to, or, that in one way or another these folks had it coming, and she also would not have allowed them to argue that because it would have indicated that she was guilty. So really the main thrust of the defense was that this, somebody else did it. We don't know who did it, and the state didn't try to find out. That was their argument. We don't know who did it, and the state didn't try hard enough to find out, but it sure wasn't her. That was what they said.
Okay. In your opinion, how or why did the assistant district attorney's closing argument affect Blanche and the jury? Specifically, when she spoke as if she were Moore's late boyfriend and said, "Blanche, you murdered me. All I ever did was love you. Why did you murder me?"
Well, she got kind of close to Blanche. I mean, physically, she came and stood in front of Blanche at the defense table, and she got kind of close to her. And my recollection, of course, we don't have footage of this, but my recollection is that Blanche kind of was taken aback by that, physically kind of withdrew from that. But as closing arguments go, that was not the most dramatic that I have seen in a courtroom. It was, I think it was effective, and the notion of having a victim cry out from the grave is a very common tactic that prosecutors use in murder trials. But it was effective, I thought, because of the way Blanche visibly recoiled. And I don't know that it would have indicated to anyone that she was guilty, but it certainly it certainly was noticeable.
Okay. In your opinion, why do you think it took the jury more than 5.5 hours to deliberate? What do you think took them so long to reach a verdict?
Well, I think they had a lot of stuff to consider. They had this letter, which was the main thrust of Blanche's defense, and so they really had to look at that because that was what she was hanging her guilt or innocence on. They really had to look at that and see if there was any chance that it was true that someone else had actually confessed to committing these crimes. And juries are not handwriting experts. They're generally they have a great range of skills and abilities and jobs as they come into a jury like that. And so none of them would consider themselves experts. And so they're going to want to gather all that stuff, and they're going to want to look at it. And, they had, I believe they had documents that the SBI had provided. They had documents to compare, handwriting documents to compare to that letter to see similarities from Blanche's handwriting that might have matched the handwriting of that letter. And just logistically to look at those things, each person is going to have to look at them side by side and pass it to the next person. You got 12 people on the jury. You also have working on a jury is a kind of a laborious process, and it takes a lot of time just to do things like vote a foreman. So you have the process of selecting a foreman, and everybody votes on that. And then somebody has to get up and go to the bathroom, and you got to schedule a lunch. And so depending on what time the jury gets a case, they may have an hour or two, and I don't remember what time this jury got this case, but let's say it's in the afternoon, and they know they're going to probably dismiss at about 5 o'clock, so they may not even get into a real deep discussion until the next day. So you don't really know how much of the time that they're out, they're actually deliberating, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes we see juries stay out for 2 or 3 days, and then sometimes as long as a week, and they come back deadlocked. This one was just long enough because I think it went over, they broke up for the day, and then they came back the next day, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so over that time period, it was like 5.5 or 6 hours of deliberations. So really that's not that long, but it was long enough, and particularly since there was the break in between overnight, it was long enough that people started thinking, well, maybe they're arguing. And often when a jury stays out for a long time, you have, you find out later that you had 1 or 2 people who were holding out. So maybe on a jury of 12, you had 10 people who believed the person was guilty or innocent, and 1 or 2 who believed very strongly the other way. And so there's a lot of arguing and persuasive arguing where they're trying to convince, the 10 might be trying to convince the 2. And if it goes on for a long time, then people inside the courtroom begin to think, well, maybe they're gonna acquit because they can't convince somebody. They can't convince 1 or 2 that they're guilty.
Yeah. Moving on from the case, in your opinion, why don't we as a society view females to be as dangerous as men?
Why don't we?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't necessarily agree that we don't. I think we don't want to, because there is a part of us that needs to believe that, women are kind and nurturing, and my God, if they're not, who do we have to rely on? And we don't necessarily always believe that men can hold their stuff together long enough to be kind and nurturing. And if women aren't kind and nurturing either, then who are we left with? So as a society, we really want to believe, we need to believe that, that women are not capable of murder, and that the one who does is the anomaly and the outlier. And I think we find it very disturbing when a woman commits murder, and particularly when a woman commits a series of murders, as this woman did. It's we can believe it, but we sure don't want to.
Okay. Considering the names that we give female serial killers, such as Black Widows or Angels of Death, do you think these labels change how we view them?
I don't. I think they reflect how we view them. Again, it's the anomaly, the angel of death. All women are angels, all mothers are angels. This woman was a mother too. She had two daughters, I believe. Anyway, she had 2 kids, and she really played on that grandmotherly image, and she continued to play on that grandmotherly image after she went to prison. I think she asked for some special dispensation on the grounds that she was a very religious, faithfully religious, God-fearing grandmother who was teaching Bible school classes in prison. And so, I have this idea of what we want women to be, and when they're not that, we call them names, and we give them these clever names that reflect their uniqueness, or what we think is their uniqueness, for having committed a really heinous act. And, we feel like we have to call them something extraordinary. She's no longer Blanche Taylor Moore, she's a Black Widow, or she's, you know what I mean? It's like, a woman who would do this. And I think the fact that we call a woman who kills her mate a Black Widow, we want to categorize them and say, okay, well, women don't do this, but if they do, there are not that many of them, and they're all alike, so we categorize them in this group so that we think we can spot them, I think that's why women get maligned if they are of a certain age and they marry someone who is much older, and people assume, that an attractive woman who marries a much older man, particularly if it's a man who has money, they assume that she has nefarious intent, that she's marrying him to take his money. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we assume about women, that we don't ascribe those qualities to men very often. You don't hear people talk about that.
My last question. Once again, considering the labels of female killers, do you think this impacts society compared to the labels and names that we give male serial killers? For example, Joe Metheny was known as the Cannibal Killer, and Richard Ramirez was known as the Night Stalker.
Okay, ask me that again, the first part of it.
How do you think the labels impact society, comparing the female labels to the male serial killer labels that we give them?
Well, I think they're more a reflection of society, but they could impact society in the way that we understand these crimes. I think we oversimplify these crimes. To understand why anybody does anything, you really have to understand that person. And, it's really, on some level, it may be impossible for someone who can't fathom committing a murder to understand someone who could commit a murder. So maybe we can't understand them. But when we give them these names, for one thing, we kind of, at least in my mind, we kind of, it's not celebratory exactly, but the infamy that comes with those kinds of names, where somebody is what was the one in California that, remember that one? Anyway, so you give somebody this name, and it conjures. We do this for a lot of reasons. It conjures up the whole case. So the guy out in California that killed all the young women out there. So somebody mentions the name of that killer or the nickname that's been given to that killer, and it's sort of a shorthand for everything that he's accused of. So it makes it easy to talk about it. But it also simplifies it, and it also almost glorifies the killer and minimizes the victims. So and we usually do this with somebody who is a serial killer and has killed a number of people. So you might remember the name of the serial killer, but you couldn't name a single one of the victims. And if you were a member of one of the victims' families, I think that would be a really grievous thing, that society remembered the guy that committed the crime, but not the suffering of the victims and their families.
Okay. Well, thank you for agreeing to this interview.
You're very welcome. I'm sorry it took us so long to get together. Did you get everything you need?
Yes, I did.